This is our academic research proposal on rent control in California. My name is Andrew Paston.
I'm Elaine Liu.
And I'm Elaine Matan.
Our introduction will cover literature review, economic theory, and hypothesis. To give a little background on rent control, it originated in response to housing shortages and an affordability crisis dating back to the early 20th century. More notably, it emerged during World War I in response to housing shortages. By definition, rent control is a set of principles that limits a landlord's ability to significantly raise residential rates, therefore offering tenants protection against arbitrary evictions and creating housing cost stability. Essentially, rent control sets a max amount landlords are able to increase rent in a year. In California, the journey of rent control has been complicated. The state has witnessed ongoing debates reflecting the ongoing struggle between landlords' interests and the need to address the issue of affordable housing. Moving on to our literature summary. Our first literature focused on the Ellis Act. Enacted in 1985, the Ellis Act provides landlords with the authority to mass evict tenants and exit the rental business. This was initially intended for situations where landlords could no longer afford to stay in the rental market. However, many critics now argue that the Ellis Act is being exploited by landlords to forcefully remove tenants from rent-controlled apartments to make way for a development of luxury housing. The article shows a 2013 Los Angeles Times analysis that revealed 51% of residential properties removed from the city's market under the Act were purchased within the preceding year. Even further, a 2016 report from the Rent Control Board in Santa Monica revealed that 38% of properties removed became condos or apartments, 22% were converted into single-family housing, and 14% became businesses. Our second article focused on the issue of affordable housing and its rippling effect on inland cities. Although traditionally considered more affordable, inland cities like Bakersfield, San Bernardino, and Fresno are now no exception to the affordable housing crisis. Bakersfield, for example, saw a 39% increase in rent prices since March 2020. Additionally, the typical rent differentials between inland and coastal cities also narrowed, going from 54% to 40% when comparing the cities Fresno and San Francisco. Finally, our third literature covers the use of Consumer Price Index as a benchmark. An economic roundtable report highlights how the Consumer Price Index is a crucial economic benchmark for determining rent increases. The CPI assesses changes in the cost of living over time and is widely accepted, although it does have its limitations. The CPI is unable to capture all elements affecting the costs of maintaining rental properties, such as regional housing market dynamics, maintenance costs, or property tax changes. Despite those weaknesses, the CPI is a good general reference point for landlords and policymakers to align rent adjustments with broader economic trends. Moving on to our economic theory.
For our economic theory, we decided to take a look into price control. But what are price controls and how are they related to rent control, and who decides when it is needed? Well, in a typical market, supply and demand, curves will intersect at an equilibrium point noted by P naught and Q naught in the top graph. Though in certain markets, such as the rental market in Los Angeles County, it becomes apparent that the demand for housing is far greater than the supply available. This is due to many factors such as job opportunities, lifestyle choices, zoning restrictions, weather, and the simple supply of housing available. This has led to LA becoming the second most expensive place to live in the US in 2023, which has created financial pressure on individuals, which some have argued leads to homelessness and housing insecure individuals. To improve the situation, governments deem it necessary to step in by setting a price control for certain markets. When these markets are rental markets, these price controls are actually price ceilings, more commonly known as rent control. In California, this means that landlords are only allowed to raise rent on certain properties by a certain percentage amount. This amount takes into account the CPI for that given year. Therefore, rent control is noted in the above graph as P max. One result of this price control is a drop in the supply of housing as producers or landlords move from supplying the Q naught market equilibrium quantity to supplying the Q1 quantity. This naturally incentivizes consumers, renters, to have a demand that meets the new maximum price the government has set through its rent control policy. This point is denoted by the intersection of the Pmax price and the Q2 point on the demand curve, creating an excess of demand calculated by Q2 minus Q1. Another way of viewing excess demand would be as a simple supply shortage. Moving on to our hypothesis. For this project, it details the relationship between rent prices and the enacted rent control policies. We have specified our control group to consist of cities that have no rent control with a total of 47 observations, and our treatment group to be comprised of cities with rent control with a total of 52 observations. Our hypothesis will argue that despite the introduction of statewide rent control policies, cities will experience an equal rise in average rent prices, regardless of any pre-existing citywide rent control measures. Alternative hypothesis is that the rate of change for cities with rent control is less than the average monthly rate of change in cities without rent control.
Our data will cover descriptive stats, sample t-tests, and our simple and multiple linear regression models. For our project, we utilized the Zillow Observed Rent Index, otherwise known as ZORI, and sorted the data by zip code. ZORI measures the change in rent prices over time while controlling for changes in the quality of available housing stock. It then calculates the price differences for the same rental unit over a period of time and aggregates those differences across all properties repeatedly listed for rent on Zillow. Additionally, all zip codes that we tested are located in California and within the time frame of January 2015 to August 2023. Now moving on to our actual data.
Here is a snapshot of our actual data, and if you see here on the white rows, it's the dollar amount for average rent for that month. And then in the yellow rows, we calculated the average rate of change per month. And then in the fifth column, we have the average rate of change of monthly rent prices by zip code. And in our next slide, I'll go over our descriptive statistics. So in summary, both groups have distributions close to normality. Sample variance is zero, indicating data to be generally very similar. And the standard deviations for both indicate a small spread in the data. The most notable difference is the difference in skew between the groups. The rent control group is negatively skewed, while the group without rent control is positively skewed. And so for our two sample t-tests, in the next slide, we use that to determine if the means from the two independent samples were the same. This is our test output conducted in R, and because the p-value of our test is less than 0.05, we reject the null hypothesis that the means of the rent control group and the non-rent control group are the same. We may conclude that the cities with rent control experience smaller rates of change in rent prices over time than cities without rent control. And then we further conducted a simple linear regression. So the dependent variable is our average monthly growth rate of rent prices, and our independent variable is the rent control. And so our p-value is 0, which indicates that it's highly significant even at the 1% significance level, and the coefficient is negative 0.002590. And so when rent control policies are in place, the growth rate of rent prices are smaller. And then moving forward, to account for other independent variables, we also conducted a multiple regression model in R. And so this is a snapshot of the data that we use, and the additional variables that we included are average rent, household income, per capita income, and walk score. And so this table shows how walk score ranks its tiers. It was measured by analyzing the walking routes to amenities in each category. The higher the score, the closer the zip code is to amenities. And then the income stats are the most current income statistics available from the US Census Bureau and the American Community Survey 2021 5-year estimates. And so our actual multiple linear regression model, the dependent variable is still the same as the previous, and the independent variables are the additional variables I mentioned earlier. We see that our findings, the rent control and walk score variables are both highly significant as indicated by the 3 asterisk symbols. The values, the p-values for both variables are close to 0, meaning both are highly significant. And so the coefficient for rent control is negative 0.01821, indicating that when rent control policies are in place, the growth rate of rent prices is smaller. The walkability score Walkability's variables coefficient is negative 0.0004, which reveals that with every point increase in the walk score, the growth rate of rent prices decreases by that amount. And so our next section is the discussion. We will talk about the limitations, effect size, and move on to our conclusion after this. And so for our limitation, our research faced many and resulted in signaling that there is biasness in our estimations. One of the limitations is that identical cities do not exist, meaning that the ideal data set cannot be obtained. The ideal data set would essentially consist of pairs of identical cities, one of each in the control and treatment groups. Having the perfect control group is essential to avoiding confounding variables, which can affect the validity of our estimations and in turn may not reflect the true relationship between the variables we are studying. That may lead to biases such as omitted variable bias. Another limitation is our missing data values. As we mentioned earlier in the snapshots, or we saw earlier, they were missing data values for the months in that Zori data set. And without the complete data collection, the sample and results can be biased because they may not accurately represent the population. And the last thing is our Zori data basically accounts for all rental stock, including those that are not affected by rent control. So that can be most single-family homes, condos, and units constructed in the past 15 years. And so the data is distorted by accounting for rent prices of properties unaffected by rent control and contributes to the results not accurately representing our population. And the last point we want to make is about effect size. This indicates how meaningful the relationship between variables and the differences between groups. And so by analyzing the effect size of each variable, it reveals the practical significance of our research outcome. So to understand the effect size, we look at the coefficients. The rent control variable, essentially, if rent control is in place, the average monthly rent price decreases by 0.1821%. That small difference could barely be noticed by renters or landlords. Thus, the lack of practical significance implies that rent control may not actually work. For the average rent price variable, when the average rent is $1 more, average rate of change in rent prices increases by 0.005173%, which is essentially zero. So cities with higher average rent prices have a negligible difference in the average rate of change compared to cities with lower rent prices. So even though rent prices can be higher in certain cities, the rate at which rent prices increase is not significantly higher than cheaper cities. And our last variable is the walk score, the coefficient, which is very close to zero, meaning there's a negligible effect size. When the walk score increases by 1 point, it does not make any change to the average rate of change of monthly rent prices. And so even though we may have the preconceived notion that highly walkable cities such as SF are more desirable and have higher demands, the negligible practical significance highlights that the availability of amenities does not really affect the average rate of change in rent prices.
Moving on to our conclusion, we will go over the statistical and practical significance, future research, and efficacy. As a result of our academic research showing that the average rate of rental price change is statistically significant but inconsequential, we have noted 3 areas in which future research can focus their work. The first being to acquire accurate data sets. As the Zori data is incomplete and includes observations in our treatment group not affected by rent control, we believe that acquiring a data set that better categorizes rental units under a rent control ordinance and those that are not would be the most beneficial. Second would be to acquire data that covers a larger time period. The COVID-19 pandemic had profound impacts on the economy at large during the time period our data was collected. This led to eviction moratoriums, additional tenant protections, stimulus checks, drastic fluctuations in employment, and other variables that had a significant but near immeasurable impact on the rate at which average rent prices increase. To adjust for this, additional research would benefit by expanding the time period in which their data is collected. Finally, additional independent variables such as age of rental property, property value, mortgage interest rates, number of bedrooms, and transit score can all be included to help develop a more accurate model that provides additional information about the dependent variable. Moving on to the efficacy of our research, our findings highlight a statistical relationship between rent control policy and average rent price increases. However, since the effect is inconsequential, this brings into question the efficacy of rent control and whether it truly benefits tenants or landlords. Due to the limitations of our study, additional research is necessary with an emphasis on gathering a data set that clearly designates which units are under rent control policy and to what degree those policies have an effect on the public. This concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.